ilex, which is a great group of little plants that live all across western North America, adapted to coastal habitats, high mountains, serpentine, even copper mines. On copper mine tailings, like the only thing living out there. So they also have, we now have a sequenced genome for Mimulus, and which should be released someday.
It is released.
Well, I mean, it's released, but published someday. And Mimulus is nice because it follows the same transect as Claus and Keckenheising, where they have the coastal, inland, alpine, which is the same pattern in Mimulus guttatus, so it's perfect for following up on their studies and figuring out what's going on along that transect. So in particular, I wanted to focus on, because there's so much history of coastal and inland types going back to Tervacin and how they're differentiated from each other. I focused on coastal and inland types for most of my thesis. And the coastal form of Mimulus guttatus is this large perennial plant, lives for many years, it flowers in the middle of the summer, whereas the inland forms are mostly annual plants. They flower really early in the spring, and they live in a very different habitat from each other. So just looking here, these are very nearby populations. You can see that the coastal in blue and inland in orange don't have very much difference in rainfall because they're so close to each other. But if you look at the seasonal temperatures, the high temperature during the summertime for inland habitats gets much higher and much hotter than in coastal habitats. And if you look at the seasonal drought in the inland habitat, you'll have green grass till May, and then in June it just rapidly goes to dry because it's the end of the rainy season. And so this is what really sets up that difference between the coastal and inland habitats, is the summertime fog in California. Whereas the inland habitat, it dries out, it gets really hot, but just over the mountain, here's the ocean underneath this cloud of fog, is a habitat that's got lots and lots of moisture year-round, stays much, much cooler, transpiration levels are lower, and so you can have a perennial type living out there. So the three main questions that I'm going to address right now are up here, and I'll just go through those. So in order to get at understanding whether there are different coast and inland ecotypes, back in our first year of grad school, Kevin Wright and myself set out on a long journey in my Honda Accord, drove 18,000 miles out to the west coast and collected about 130 populations all along the coast. And the way we did this was, instead of doing the transect across California like Claus and Keckenheising did, we decided to go perpendicular. And so we went straight up and down and collected paired populations of coast and inland populations throughout California and Oregon. So there's 14 different pairs here. And so with this, we can ask whether populations that are nearby to each other are more closely related to each other, or whether populations all along the coast are in one group related to each other versus all the populations inland in another group. And so to do that, you can conduct a population structure analysis using something like Jonathan Pritchard's structure program, and using microsatellite data from about 500 different individuals collected from coast and inland populations, we see a pretty distinct splitting between inland populations and coastal populations when you give the program a prior of 2 populations. And you can analyze this a different way and look at this using a population graph program, which actually uses graph theory techniques to look at the number of connections between populations, the minimum number of connections that explain the data. And what's really nice about this is that then you can test afterwards and ask whether there are more connections within a particular group than between the 2 groups. And in this case, there are a lot more connections within the groups than between groups. And the cool thing, the really cool thing, is that the size of the ball is the within population heterozygosity, so how diverse that population is. So all of the inland populations have a higher diversity than the coastal populations. And the coastal populations, when you look closer at the data, it looks like they have a subset of the alleles of all of the inland populations. So it looks like it may be that the coastal populations are derived in some way from some set of inland populations sometime in the past. So now that we know that these are 2 separate groups, or at least appear to be separate groups, we want to ask, what maintains them as separate groups? How are they adapted to their different habitats? And so in order to do this, we set up paired reciprocal transplant experiments. First, Megan Hall, who used to be a grad student in our lab, set a reciprocal transplant experiment in